Aston Martin is one of the teams that brought the most pleasant surprise to Formula One, and after being labelled as a copycat team for the previous seasons, they're finally showing that their place is here in Formula One. Alonso and Stroll had one of the greatest races of their careers, given the fact that they drive for a team that finished 7th in 2022, and as things stand, they can fight with Ferrari as well, not just Mercedes. So how does a team manage to turn things around in a matter of 6 months and become a top 2 team after being at the back of the midfield? The Bahrain GP never fails to disappoint, and last year we saw a 1-2 Ferrari finish after such a long time. This time, Red Bull took what was theirs in a dominant win, and it was Leclerc who suffered Verstappen and Perez's fates in 2022, with him having to end the race prematurely due to reliability issues. On the other hand, Aston Martin is definitely a team on the rise, and now that all the sandbags have been left in the pre-season testing in Bahrain, one couldn't help but wonder what on earth is happening in Aston Martin. It's a bit hard to understand how a team that had such poor performances in 2021 and 2022 managed to rack up a P3 and P6 finish on the first race of the season, schooling both Mercedes drivers and Sainz on the way to doing so. It's definitely got to do with the money, but this time it seems like Aston Martin put their money where their mouth is. Lawrence Stroll has finally understood that he can have one of the best teams on the grid if he manages to take 2 steps back and let the professionals do their job, which in this case are people who were bred back in Red Bull. Dan Follows is a British Formula One aerodynamicist, and he's one of the few people who can brag about the fact that he was trained personally by Adrian Newey. He's definitely the guy that Aston Martin has to say thank you to due to their recent success. And one couldn't help but wonder, is Red Bull regretting the fact that they let go of Fallows so easily? After all, this is a sport of movement, and people are transferring to other teams all the time. Rare are the times when they notch successes like Fallows did at Aston Martin so soon. Christian Horner opened up about Aston Martin's competitiveness, and when talking about the AMR 23, he couldn't help but compare it with the RB18, the most dominant car that has exited production out of Milton Keynes. Based on the race, you'd have to say they were the second strongest here. They've obviously done a good job over the winter. They say imitation is the biggest form of flattery, and, it's good to see the old car. Referring to Red Bull's RB18 used in the 2022 season doing so well. While Fallows could have barely climbed the ladder any further in Red Bull, with him having to satisfy the head of the aerodynamic department as the highest possible role, it was evident that Red Bull would have to give up on his services because an individual of his calibre is poised for success with positions higher than what he had in Red Bull. After all, the Austrian team opted for the duo of Pierre Wache and Adrian Newey, and Dan Fallows doesn't have anything to regret in this regard. Quite the contrary, he's the driving force behind Aston Martin's recent success, and the fact that the team is now battling successfully with Ferrari and Mercedes goes to show that their winter goals have been achieved. Wolff has also spoken about the success of Aston Martin, saying that they now have a car that's 1 second ahead of them and that they basically have 50% of the same parts as the W14, which goes to show that improvements under the engine freeze era are possible if you know how to properly do them. Many people were left wondering as to how Stroll's team managed to be competitive in times where the rule change wasn't that huge, and quite honestly, nobody projected any team to make progress as much as Aston Martin did. F1 is a technical and complicated sport, and no matter how good a driver you are, you need the perfect engineering miracle if you want to be competitive. If Stroll was able to finish P6 and beat Russell in a direct battle, then it goes to show that the AMR 23 is definitely the thing to keep an eye on for the remainder of the season. One thing that we cannot help but notice is the similarity that the AMR 23 has with the RB18, like Horner said. With Dan Fallows being the technical director of Aston Martin, it's evident that the first thing he'd do is apply the successful story of Red Bull's design. Quite honestly, Fallows left Red Bull in April 2022, but this was already the time when the team had it all figured out in terms of aerodynamic performance and the design of the car. This has been hinted by Helmut Marko, Red Bull's special advisor, with him further adding, "If you compare the cars, you can see that the Aston Martin is most similar to Red Bull. That certainly has its reasons. It wasn't just Dan Fallows who went to Aston Martin, but also a few other people, and obviously they have a good memory." However, Aston Martin tried to copy designs back in 2022 in Barcelona and for the entire 2019 season. And while the latter campaign secured them the P3 spot in the Constructors' Championship, it was a different time back then. Now the regulations are very strict, and finding such a great gap in performance is something that's worth praising for Aston Martin. Keep in mind that the team is still waiting for their brand new factory to open for business. And with that in mind, we are still trying to understand what it is that changed drastically in Aston Martin, that they went from constantly exiting in Q3 in 2022 to actually beating two of the top three teams in 2023. Philosophy is a very strong thing in Formula One, and if you remember correctly, Ralf Schumacher has spoken to the media about the narrative that's present in Aston Martin, with him saying that Sebastian Vettel told him about Lawrence Stroll's constant involvement in the team. This was the reason why Otmar Schaffnauer was sacked by the team at the last race of the 2021 season, and it seems like Aston Martin's boss understood that money can only take you so far if you don't have the right staff. Poaching staff in Formula One, as we mentioned earlier in this video, is a never-ending process, and usually the team with the brightest potential and thickest bank account wins in terms of signing the brightest people on the grid. Of course, not everyone is available, so you always have to improvise in this matter, but one couldn't help but wonder, have the egos and stubbornness in Aston Martin been put aside for the greater good of the team? For example, if you see McLaren and Alpine, they're taking a backward step, and it just goes to show that they're actually going to struggle a lot in the upcoming period, mostly because of management issues. On the other hand, Aston Martin has left everyone embarrassed, and the fact that they were able to beat Sainz and Mercedes in a direct on-track battle goes to show that the hype is real and Aston Martin is here to stay. Alonso will most likely achieve the 100th podium of his career in an Aston Martin, notching the 99th in the first race of the 2023 season. During the radio conversations, we saw questions being asked from Alonso to his race engineer that were of great technical value, which goes to show that the expertise he brings to the table is something out of this world. Not to say that Vettel wasn't the right guy for this job, it's just that the team's mindset and philosophy haven't aligned with the four-time world champion's aspirations to remain with the team. While we're very sad to not see Vettel competing for podium finishes and potentially winning, he has a great successor. And now another thing that we're bound to see is Stroll actually levelling up his game and being more competitive in 2023. This isn't too far-fetched of a scenario, and now that Stroll understands that he could be ashamed on a regular basis by his teammate Alonso, it's very necessary for him to step up his game and complete the dominance of Aston Martin, the team that's very likely to be in the top three finishes at the end of the 2023 season in the Constructors' Championship. With that being said, what do you think about Aston Martin? Do you think that they can win a race later in the season? Let us know in the comments below.